We are really fortunate to have Rabbi Michael Zedek with us, who is, as he was just mentioning, Rabbi Emeritus at two congregations, Temple Emmanuel in Chicago and Temple B'nai Yehuda here in the Kansas City area, which used to be even closer to us. Yeah.
69th and
69. I don't know how far back we know each other. I don't even remember, so that tells you something, but I think it was when I took classes to the synagogue back in the old location.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we've had some conversations over the years, usually me picking your brain on Jewish matters related to preaching and worship and Bible and whatever. But it's a really great honor to have him with us, and please welcome Rabbi Michael Zedek.
Michael, thank you, of course, and it's one. If nothing else, if you get nothing else, I'm just happy that I got to see Michael again, speakers have endless varieties of responses to introductions. True, and I'm offering these two to you at no additional charge. The first of which is, of all the introductions I've ever received, that's the most recent. Second is, this is, if you like that one, wait till you hear what's coming next. Namely, that introduction was so precious that it reminds me of the time when the person who was supposed to introduce me never showed up, so I had to introduce myself. Which is to say, by the way, the whole purpose of an introduction is in some fashion to seduce you into thinking that the person is worth listening to, after which you're going to make up your own mind anyway. True? So just a couple of things before we actually plunge in. One, if I say something that's not clear to you, doesn't make sense to you, what the heck is he talking about? I've heard different understandings of that, and I want to present it because I think you may not be going in a direction that I would find meaningful, even if you don't have to concur with it, but just don't find it meaningful. Say so. Stop me. Politely, I hope. But I find myself interesting, but I'm not just interested in hearing myself. Okay? So with that in mind, I want to start with something that may very likely become common if you stay with me for these three presentations. I love stories. First of all, I think stories are the things we remember far more than we remember essays. The illustrations, examples help us keep concretely in mind what in the heck we're supposedly to remember. And stories also have a magical ability to outflank our resistance to change. They can tell us something about our best, even when we're not functioning at that level, which may be the enduring power of the Hebrew Bible, by the way, since it's just story after story after story after story. So here's the story. It's a true story, by the way. Anybody know the name, besides you and me, Reverend Fred Craddock? Oh, good. He was truly one of the great pulpit presence in American church history. He spoke here? He spoke everywhere, but I'm not surprised. He tells the story of his first trip to Israel. And anybody been to Israel? Okay. So you had the best guide ever, right? Michael was the guide? Well, no, but you also had an Israeli guide. Yeah. Now, every single group that has ever gone to Israel, every person thinks their guide is the single best guide ever. And the answer is because the guide course in Israel, to be licensed as a guide, is one of the hardest courses in the country. It's remarkable, all the stuff they have to learn. You think becoming a docent at the Nelson Atkins is tough. Ha! So at any rate, the guide says, such and such a miracle occurred here. Craddock immediately said, I hope you don't mind if I have a different understanding. You know this story? If I have a different understanding. And without missing a beat, the guide said, of course not. You can be sure if there's only one way to understand something, it didn't come from God. Now that, by the way, captures the heart of what I'll call the millennials-long Jewish love affair with the text. It was an encounter through the generations. It's an encounter of conversations through the generations, and it's an encounter that insists we have not yet done all the unpacking, nor have we finally, this is what it means, and it's the only thing it means. In fact, to interpret a text in only one fashion would be, from the Jewish tradition's perspective, to miss the meanings in it. Even more severely, to interpret the text literally is to be sinfully engaged in minimizing the importance of the text. We have never been literalists. We have never been inerrantists. In fact, from the perspective of Jewish tradition, these texts are not dictated by God. They are an effort by human beings to understand the divine perspective on the human situation. And boy, is the divine perspective on the human situation filled with moments where, boy, do we mess up. And then we mess up again, and we mess up again and again. In fact, an aside, one of the most curious things about the whole Hebrew Bible is, what would you say about a people who preserve this endless record of them failing to live up to the expectations? I mean, certainly not the way America functions. I mean, there's nothing wrong with us. We are the best, no matter what the real information reveals. We are number one, right? You know, and God forbid we take a look at a critical view of American history where there's both the wondrous and the problematic. That would be too dangerous because we wouldn't be raising good. At any rate, stop with the polemics. So, one of the ways to look at this is that to say Shakespeare is great and the Bible is great is not the same thing. Shakespeare is clearly the single most remarkable, certainly in English and perhaps in any language, human perspective on the human situation. The Hebrew Bible presents itself as a divine perspective on the human situation. That's the critical difference, and we're going to look at it in more nuanced fashion as well. This is in the way, isn't it? For Jewish tradition, every single text in the Hebrew Bible exists on a minimum of 4 levels. Those 4 levels yield a beautiful Hebrew acronym. Don't worry, if you haven't taken your Hebrew yet, I promise to translate. And I'm even going to do it in English. Some of you may know that Hebrew does not have what we call vowels. They're a later addition. So the Hebrew, just to show that I can do it, that's what I just wrote in English. It's pronounced pardes. Keep that in mind. First level is peshat, which means the literal meaning. The sea split and they walk through on dry ground. Okay? The second level is remez. It means hint or clue, which is to say, if we were just use the critical faculties we employ when we're analyzing any text, but we might put aside, because after all, it's the Hebrew Bible, we might see something deeper, something curious. For instance, the sea split and they walk through on dry ground. Shouldn't there be mud? Make sense, right? Third level, drosh. By the way, that's the modern Hebrew word for a sermon, which Webster defined as a tedious moral homily, but don't worry about that part. Drosh means the ethical meaning, the teaching, the lesson. I'll get way ahead of myself. For instance, if you follow the biblical, the Exodus story, it takes 10 plagues to get the Israelites out of Egypt, right? Wouldn't one have been enough for you to be convinced, this isn't going to work out well, I think I should let them go? But the text says 10. By the way, in rabbinic tradition, they add thousands upon thousands of plagues, which is their way of playing with that love affair that we have with the text. 10 plagues, they get out, and Yul changes his mind. Right? Now, the first challenge is that the Egyptian chariots and the charioteers none of them must be firstborn, because all of them have been wiped out in the 10th plague, right? But they go after them. The Israelites are stuck out in the wilderness by the Yam Suf, which is not the Red Sea. Yam Suf is the Sea of Reeds. We used to call it the Isthmus of Suez. There's no more Isthmus of Suez. There's a canal there. In fact, what we're talking about is a low-lying, swampy land, right? So, as the movie portrayed for our generation, Edward G. Robinson sees the dust cloud of the Egyptian tanks, the ancient equivalent chariots, coming in the distance, right? And he's, why'd you bring us out here to die? Weren't there enough graves in Egypt? Over and over again, they're going to sound that commentary, right? And Charlton Heston says, this is my best Charlton Heston imitation, Be still and see the workings of the Lord. Right? Good, right? Yeah, a little applause, but no, that's all right. I'm not begging. Then the text says, Moses turns to God, and the text says God said. Notice I didn't say God said. I don't know what God said. I know what the text says. Tell the children, why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, which may be the single most remarkable miracle in the whole story, that they go forward. But back to the story. Why don't the Israelites say, look at these stupid Egyptians? Don't they realize we got God playing for our team, and he's even better than Patrick Mahomes? I'm sorry to bring that up. But seriously. But they panic. The sea splits, they walk through on dry ground. Every time what you and I would call a miracle occurs in the Hebrew Bible, there's always a hint or clue, watch out, something funny's going on. Remember I talked about, where's the mud? So they walk through, right? Everything is fine. You're an Egyptian chariot driver. You're going to drive in there? You got to be out of your freaking mind, right? But the text says they do, and whoosh, bye-bye. Except the Hebrew, then the children, by the way, that then is really important. Then the children of Israel had emunah, always mistranslated as faith. It means confidence. Confidence in God and in Moses, God's servant. It also says, then the children of Israel beheld Egypt, not Egyptians, Egypt, dead on the shores of the sea. But that's not the challenge. The challenge is the pattern. What happens next? Everything's fine, right? Until the next chapter. We've got no water. Why did you bring us out here to die? Weren't there enough graves in Egypt? And as you know, split the rock, by the way. Many years ago, I spent a week camping in the Sinai. They'll give you a geology hammer, 3 different forms of geological formation. Granite, sandstone, and limestone. Limestone, when water falls on it, hollows out. There'll be some moisture, not enough for 600,000 people, men, blah, 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 but don't worry about it. The pattern is the point, because what happens? They get water, everything's fine, right? Until the next chapter. We've got nothing to eat. In Egypt, I'm quoting, we had leeks and garlic and cucumbers. Why did you bring us out here to die? And what do they get? Manna, which is the Hebrew Bible's idea of humor. They called it manna because they looked at it, I'm quoting, and they said manhu, which is ancient Hebrew for, what is it? Mystery meat. SOS. Now, there are speculations that it was the oozings of a tamarisk tree, which grows in the desert and is a source of protein. There's even, I'm sorry to get into this. Have you all had dinner yet?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Some people claim it's bird guano, which is, in Peru, a major source of one of the native communities' source of protein. And as it happens, the Sinai is one of the world's great natural bird flyways, because in a moment we're going to get to that one. Manna, fine, everything's good, right? We're sick and tired of manna. My God, why'd you bring us out here to die? We want meat. And what happens? Next day, camp surrounded by boids, right? That's my Brooklyn translation, boids. They pop them in the oven, everything's fine. They get to Mount Sinai. God, in the single most remarkable revelatory experience in human history. Now, revelation normally is to one person or 3 persons, but an entire nation hears the voice of God aside. You ready for this?
I'm going to try.
One of the things the text says is, what did they hear? They heard, because as you may recall, this is too much for us. You talk to God. We'll listen to what you say. The tradition says they heard the first letter of the first word of the 10 Commandments. The first letter of the first word of the 10 Commandments is the Hebrew letter Aleph, like alphabet, Aleph. Aleph has no sound. They heard silence. Now, the overwhelming experience of silence might lead to an awareness of awesome dread and wonder. But, back to the story. They get to Mount Sinai, God speaks to the entire people, Moses is up on the mountain, he spends a few days up there, and what do? They build a golden calf. Now, these are either the dumbest people who ever walked the face of the earth, and by the way, whatever one thinks of the Jewish story, nobody's ever accused the Jewish people of being definitively dumb. Or there's something more going on here. And these stories aren't history, they're spiritual autobiography far more than they are historical. And let me explain what I mean by that. Martin Luther King Jr.'s explanation of these stories was, I'm getting pretty close to the quote here, these stories demonstrate that it is easier to get the slaves out of Egypt than it is to get Egypt out of the slaves. Now, that's always true. It's always been true in every movement for national liberation or personal liberation. What keeps us enslaved has long ago lost its grip on us. We have not yet let it go. But there's another explanation. Here's mine. People are free to disbelieve the evidence of their own experience. To wit, one of the old prayer books of my movement had, days pass, years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. What isn't a miracle? If one understands, oh boy, is this something? I didn't get to this yet, did I? So miracle. Thank you. Sometimes the mind goes faster than the body. Okay, drash, ethical meaning, the lesson, the teaching. We just tried to do a little bit of that with regard to the Exodus story. The last level is sod, which means secret meaning. So don't tell anybody, okay? By the way, traditionally you have to be 40 years old or older to learn the secret meaning. I think they were concerned that if you understood that there really is no Santa Claus, you might, if God is dead, everything is permitted sort of thing. If a God who keeps score. Secret meaning, seas don't split and you walk through on dry ground. I could stand over a mud puddle all day and all night. It isn't going to happen. It might dry up, but it isn't going to split. So, pardes. Does that sound like any English word? Oh, that's nice. Paradise. That's the origin of the word paradise. Now, in Hebrew, it means orchard, which is an interesting notion of how we look at the text. There's endless numbers of nourishing fruits in these texts. Pardes, paradise, orchard. Now, I mentioned miracle. I hope this isn't going to shock you too much. If I were to ask you for a definition of miracle, I'm reasonably confident that you would include the word a supernatural intervention into the regular routine of experience. Fair? Yeah? Would it shock you even further to know that there's no such word in the Hebrew Bible for that kind of word for miracle? It doesn't shock you? No. Why not?
Because Mike has shared with us how difficult it is to find meanings that translate to words we understand.
That's a very important point, of course. That translation is always, I've got to say one thing and eliminate others. For sure, we're going to see that when we start going deeper into text itself. But there are three words that are understood in the English language to be something like the word miracle, but they just don't mean a supernatural intervention. Here are the three words. Nes, ot, and pele. Nes literally means a sign or a symbol. Ot literally means a letter of the alphabet or a sign, because, or I should say a symbol, because after all, letters are simply symbols that we mean that is an A, right? That's just a convention that we've decided that's what A is. Fair? And pele, which is my favorite, pele means a wow. What isn't a wow if we would just be aware that, as Elizabeth Barrett Browning put it, earth's crammed with heaven, and every bush is afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. Now, the rest of the poem, which is rarely quoted, is, well, others just sit around and pluck blackberries. And if I could have a conversation with her, I think what she's trying to say, when it's just plucking blackberries, it's a burning bush. If we would just understand, recognize, be alert to, and aware that in some fashion there's nothing but miracle. The problem is that we endlessly divide our world, because all of us are dualists, the ordinary and extraordinary, right? And what do we do with the extraordinary? We have no choice. It slaps us across the face and says, pay attention. And what do we do with the ordinary? That's equally clear. We take it for granted. So I would suggest in some ways the religious imagination is to find ways to take the ordinary for granted less. Notice I didn't say to not take it for granted, because we can't help ourselves. Because if we were fully present to that miracle as always, we'd wake up in the morning, I'd go, "Huh?" And that's the last thing I do that day. Because there are burning bushes scattered randomly through every day, and I have to ignore some of them if I'm going to get through the day. But if we were to take the ordinary for granted less, our lives would be more filled with life. By the way, P.S. advertisement. I have a manuscript that will be published, God willing, in the next number of months on this topic. You're welcome. It'll never be a major motion picture, but you're welcome to buy several copies. Never mind. So, with that as some background, let's see what else I want to do preliminarily. Okay, one other thing, and then we're going to plunge into a text. Again, my tongue is firmly in my cheek. Had I written the Hebrew Bible, it would have been much better. I mean by that, it would be so normative to insist that only members of my group have a relationship with deity. Yeah. But thank God I didn't write it, because you don't have to be a member of a particular club, it insists, in order to be connected to the sacred. In fact, this small thing is one of the most regularly misunderstood concepts in religious literature is, what does it mean to be chosen people? Because lots of people think it means that somehow, because you're chosen, you have the right to do to others, whether they want you to or resist or not, you have that right to be, because you're superior. You've got a connection to the big guy. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy people. By the way, that's an ancient way of saying we hold these truths to be self-evident. All are equal, because you're not the priest, you're your own priest. You don't need someone else to do that for you. Is a way of saying that. But as well, you shall be a kingdom of priests, and thank God it doesn't say, because I said if I had written them, you shall be the kingdom of priests and the holy people. That's your job description. But others can have that job description too. Or to quote Isaiah, you shall be to me an or lagoyim, a light to the nations. A, not the. Because what chosen means is not that you're better than others, it's that you're called to be better than you are. And that is a job from which there's no retirement. I guarantee you. Okay, let's take one more thing. In Jewish tradition, we have, I mentioned, this love affair with the text, which is usually translated into what's called midrash. You see the word drash in there? Exploring. Midrash would be commentaries on the text, or as someone once said, to fill in the space between the letters. Okay. Now here's a clever notion. The historian says, it happened and I can prove it. The theologian says, it happened, I can't prove it, but I believe it. The student of Midrash says, it didn't happen, but I can make it happen. Okay. It's the imaginative faculty of engagement with the text and its stories, passionate engagement. Because truthfully, I'm sure you've heard the fancy schmancy word exegesis. There's no such thing as exegesis. It's all eisegesis. It's our encounter with the text, and I'm telling you what the text says in me this week. I mean, the text doesn't change, but insights do, because we change, of course. So let's go with, I'll use the Hebrew text. We're going to start with Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. And if you don't have a text, get one.
There's some laying around on the table.
There are.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And while you have the wrong translation, if there's some distinctively different notion from what I'm going to share, say so, okay? Deal? Good. All right, so this is the Jewish Publication Society translation, and I'll do some nuances as well, because, again, every translation makes choices of the limits of language to be able to fully convey what's going on. So, the man now was intimate with his wife. She became pregnant and gave birth to Cain, saying, "Both I and the Eternal have made a man." Anybody got some? That's chapter 4, verse 1 of Genesis. Anybody got something that's significantly different? Or that's pretty close? Okay. So, they had physical intimacy, and she gives birth, and she gives the kid a name. By the way, the name in Hebrew is Cain, ki kaniti ish im Elohim. Do you hear the assonance? Cain ki kaniti. See, I mean, it's a word play. Literally, because I made a man with God, which is to say, very important. Men don't listen. The first comment about the nature of reality made by a person in the Hebrew Bible is by a woman. I find that compelling. The first comment about the nature of reality in the Hebrew Bible is put in the mouth of a woman, which is more accurate. Who knows what, okay? I have made a human being with God's help. Now it gets really fascinating, which I find it remarkable that anybody could be a literalist about some of this stuff. She then continued giving birth to his brother Abel. Abel became a shepherd while Cain tilled the soil. One of the things that's absolutely remarkable about the Hebrew Bible is its economy of language. What school did they go to? Were they cute kids? Nothing. They're already adults and they're working, right? But also notice what's missing. We got an origin for why she called him Cain, but we don't get anything about why she named him Abel, right? Now, Abel in Hebrew is Hevel. How's your Hebrew?
It's okay.
You know what Hevel means?
Yeah, like temporary or...
Oh, you're being very polite. Hevel means a puff of wind, or you'll forgive me, a little fart. In Ecclesiastes, will you forgive me? Because I'm just quoting. In Ecclesiastes, you have the phrase Hevel Chavelim, which is translated fancy schmancy, vanity of vanities. Now, I would submit to you, you don't name a child puff of wind if you have any ambitions for the child, or for that matter, if you're assuming that you're dealing with historical facts. It's a dead giveaway. Watch out. Something very curious, and maybe some things very curious, are about to happen. Next thing that happens is they already have their occupations, right? One is a shepherd, and the other is a farmer. Fair? What's the older occupation? Agrarian, you're saying? Farmer? How many say farmer's the older occupation? How many shepherd? All right, so let's sit here and shepherd is the older occupation because you think?
There were hunter-gatherers before they were...
Are you speaking metaphorically or anthropologically?
Now I'm speaking anthropologically. What is the older occupation? Well, but this, we don't have that choice. We have shepherds,
That's why.
the shepherds or farmers. And the honest answer is nomadic communities were the earliest experience of humans, and they had flocks that went with them from water source to water source, from pasture source to pasture source. It is only approximately some 10,000 or so years ago that we unlocked the secret of the seed, which made settlement possible, which made cities possible, which made civilization possible. Somewhere between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, we begin to have what we call history. Everything before that is called prehistoric, which is fascinating in terms of what we're about to learn. So the other thing that's fascinating about shepherds and farmers is they have competing economic interests right from the get-go. We're not that far from Oklahoma. Oh, the farmers and the cowboys shall be friends, right? What's so unusual about that song is because farmers and cowboys are not naturally friends. Give me land, lots of land, under rolling skies above. Don't fence me in. And a farmer's got to have a fence or the farmer has no crop. Fair? It's almost remarkable that this insight is there in terms of what's going to be a horrifying denouement, right? The first murder, according to the story. So, we've got this built-in challenge. One day in the course of time, Cain brought some of his harvests and offering to the Eternal, and Abel too brought an offering from among the choice lamb of his flocks and their fattest parts. The Eternal approved Abel and his offering, but did not approve Cain and his offering. Cain was filled with rage, and I love this, and his face fell. So, text doesn't care. How did they know to bring an offering? Where did they bring the offering? Who officiated over the offering? It just doesn't care about that, but it makes the point that one offering was viewed favorably, and the other offering, not so good. Now, there are those who would argue because it says Cain brought an offering, but Abel brought the best, right? Regardless, the important point is that one was accepted and the other was less acceptable. But here's where it gets exquisite. The Eternal One, and again, folks, if anybody's got a big difference, if it's important, I want you to take it. I'm serious.
What's the point of the offer? What's the point of the offer?
Text doesn't seem to care about that, but we're going to get to an interesting alternative meaning about the offering, okay?
That's not the point of conflict resolution, then, is what you're saying.
Not yet, okay? The Eternal then said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? Would you not do well to lift it? For if you do not do well, sin is a demon at the door. You are the one it craves, and yet you can govern it." Translation in more plain English: Cain, we're just talking about a ritual here. What really matters is your behavior. What you do is far more important than the rituals that you may embrace or ignore. Sin I'm going to be more faithful to the Hebrew. Sin crouches at the door, but you can be its master. That's what it said, which, by the way, is a different notion in Jewish tradition vis-a-vis the doctrine of original sin, which is, at the heart of the Christian story.
One version.
For Jewish tradition, human beings are neutral. The same person is capable of extraordinary good and horrifying malevolence. The same person. So, what the text seems to be rebuking Cain is, why are you upset about an offering? If you're going to be upset about something, be upset about, did I live up to a standard of behavior that matters? But it gets worse. Cain now thought about his brother Abel. That's terrible. And Cain said to his brother Abel, okay, is the more literal translation. And now, the Hebrew text does not have what you have. Don't you have, let us go out into the field? Yeah. Have you ever heard of the word the Masoretic text? The oldest full text of the Hebrew Bible we have does not have their conversation. So rabbinic tradition fills it in with endless varieties of what did they argue about. But the Septuagint, which is what is based on the translation you have there in terms of filling in, let us go out into the field. Now, it makes sense because the next thing we're going to know is we're going to have the first murder in a field. So, let us go out into the field, and then when they're in the field, Cain turned on, I got to turn the page, his brother Abel and killed him. Anybody remember 2001: A Space Odyssey? Yeah? So one of my favorite parts of the movie is the part before they get to the spaceship stuff, where you have these proto-human ancestors. The movie starts in a desolate wilderness, right? And there's this an ancestor wandering across in this dry, desert-like environment, comes across a bunch of bones, right? And listen, there's not a lot of entertainment, so it goes distracting, goes through the bones, and happens to come upon the jawbone. Now, jawbone is shaped like that. That's the helicopter view. So it looks a lot like a sickle, right? It's exactly what it looks like. It also happens to be the strongest bone in the body. He picks up I don't know if I think he's a he, because it's violence, it must be a he. He picks up the jawbone and he goes on the other bones, and they shatter. And he goes, and they shatter. And he goes, and whoa, this is fun. Shatter, shatter, shatter. Next scene, water hole, right? And there's this ritualized thing about who's going to get to drink from the water hole. Closer and closer. And can you imagine what the breath must have been like? But this guy doesn't know that I got this. And they get close to each other, and this guy goes, whoomp, and the other goes. Nobody's ever done that before. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. Over and over and over again, long after it's any longer necessary, because nobody's ever killed before. How do you know how to kill, right? And then Kubrick has this proto-human throw the jawbone up into the air. This is, for those of you, I'm accurately recalling it. It goes slow motion, spinning, 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 and all of a sudden it becomes the spaceship taking the explorers to the moon, where they're going to meet that obelisk that ends up leading to Jupiter, et cetera, right? All clear? That's the story. What that story is suggesting is something like what we're going to see in a moment. Civilization begins with violence. It's one of the horrifying stepstones that got us here this evening. At any rate, back on the trail. First murder. Then the Eternal One said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" Which is to say, we have the indictment. And he replied, "How should I know? Am I my brother's keeper?" Not much of a defense. By the way, the presumption is not only you're supposed to be your brother's keeper, you're supposed to be your brother's brother. And God said, "What have you done?" Verdict, very short trial. "Your brother's blood is shrieking to me from the ground. Now you are cursed by this very soil which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hands. When you till the soil, no longer shall it give you its yield. You shall become a rootless wanderer on the earth." So the punishment has two aspects. One, farming is going to be hard work. Fair? Two, you're going to be a rootless wanderer or a ceaseless wanderer on the earth. Okay? By the way, what should the punishment be?
Question.
Yeah.
Cain was not the tiller of the ground, was he?
Yeah, he was the farmer.
He was the farmer. Okay.
Yeah. It's interesting that Abel, the so-called younger one, is the older profession. Yeah. So, farming is going to be hard work, and you're going to be a ceaseless or rootless wanderer. My question remains. What should the punishment be according to the Hebrew Bible?
Kick him out.
Well, we've already done that. Murder is a capital offense according to the Bible. But God is a pinko commie liberal judge and lets him off. Right? You're going to be a ceaseless wanderer, and farming will be hard work. Now, I used to have, a really good memory. If an author on page 77 said X, and 250 pages later, he or she said, "Oops, because it takes a long time to write a book, could have forgotten, and then no proofreader, blah, 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 blah." Okay, but look what's going to happen. Cain then said to the Eternal, "My punishment is too heavy to bear." Finally opens his big mouth, right? "Seeing as now you have expelled me from the face of the soil, and I must hide from your face, I have become a rootless wanderer on the earth, and anyone who finds me might kill me." Look at all the problems in that text. First of all, he has a much more limited view of deity than his mother, thinking deity is limited to a place. You've banished me from you. Who said that? He's good. And then anyone who meets me may kill me. Now, I've read the Hebrew Bible, and if I were a literalist, here's my problem. I'm not a literalist. There was Adam and Eve, there was Cain, and there's no more Abel. Who's going to meet him? Well, obviously, he's never read the Hebrew Bible. He doesn't realize there's nobody else, right? which makes no sense. Obviously, this story intends that there's people. But it gets even more extraordinary. Look at the next verse. Not so, said the Eternal. Should anyone kill Cain, he would be avenged sevenfold. God hasn't read the Bible. God also thinks there are human beings beyond Cain. And the Eternal gave Cain a sign that none who came upon him would kill him. Now, remember I talked about secret meanings? The last level of the so-called four levels? I'm going to trust you with this, but you can't tell anybody. Has anybody seen the awful movie, The Bible? But you know, the mark of Cain in English is a mark of being an outcast. It's some kind of defect. And in the movie, The Bible, he gets this horrifying scar on his forehead that people will stay away from him, right? But in the Bible, it's a mark of divine connection. We just read that, right? So here's the mark of Cain. Again, I'm being somewhat facetious, but also very telling in terms of, I think, what's being strived to being conveyed. Adam and Eve are born from the ground. Cain is the first person, the text says, born in a vaginal birth, which is to say he's the first person with a belly button. And a belly button is a reminder of the miraculous fact of our being. I mean, we begin life in freaking water. In fact, it's a wonderful story. There's twins in the womb. One twin is a believer that there's life after the womb. The other twin is a cynic. There is no life after the womb. And they argue all the time. The believing twin says, not only is there life after the womb, we will breathe air. Breathe air. Life is only possible in water. It's a well-known scientific fact. Not only will we breathe air, we'll eat through the mouth. Mouth! All nourishment comes through the umbilical cord. Everyone knows this. Where are you getting these crazy ideas? Just then, and this is exquisite, just then there's an earthquake. Labor begins. Right? And as good storytelling requires, the believing twin is forced down the birth canal first. And the cynic is left back there, sees a great light, and hears a cry. And it's worse than I thought. It's not that there's no life after the womb, there's punishment after the womb. So, belly button, a reminder that you and I are exquisitely, divinely, preciously, miraculously connected to the divine. Yes, sir. I think you have your hand up. Now you have both hands up. Okay.
Okay. This has always been a puzzle to me.
A little louder.
This has always been a puzzle to me. Adam and Eve were the first man and the first woman. Cain kills Abel. Subsequently, Cain marries a wife.
She was a really good-looking orangutan.
Really?
No! The text clearly assumes...
I want an answer.
I'm giving you one.
Okay.
The text obviously assumes, it makes no sense unless there are people. Because why would Cain be worried about anyone meeting him unless he knows there are people? Why would God say anyone who meets you and kills you, sevenfold vengeance? It only makes sense if you recognize that you're dealing with an allegorical circumstance that applies to you and me. Otherwise, these are silly.
But Adam and Eve were the first.
Adam and Eve are the notion that every human being is of absolute sacred value. If you think we all started with one, I don't have that problem that you may have. I don't take the text literally as history. I take it as incredibly important lessons for what it means to be a creature in the image of God, which is, I think, the fundamental. Because you got two different stories. You got human beings were created with the image of God. That's the first story. And then the second, was sometimes inaccurately called the second creation story. You got Adam, which means earth. And from Adam, you get two, Adam and Chava, Eve. Not from his rib, which is a bad translation. It's two sides, which is the same metaphor as the myth that Plato associates with all human beings were originally two, and we're split, and that's why we look for the other. We're searching for our other. But my only problem with what you're saying is I don't for a moment think that the human story began with one human.
Okay, so
I don't think the text does either. That's nice. I like that. But let me put it this way. Oh, boy. We're going to need 72 classes. Anybody ever heard of the Enuma Elish? The Enuma Elish is one of the oldest creation stories. It's one of the oldest stories, period. It is the creation myth of ancient Mesopotamia. And in it, you'll find the following. The gods are at war. First of all, there are gods, and they're at war. The war is indecisive, because how can gods fight to a conclusion? But the gods decide it has to be brought to a conclusion. Each side is going to pick a champion who will fight to the death. Oh, gods can die in this story. The good gods, that is, the gods are going to win, choose as their champion Marduk. It's a cognate of the Hebrew name Mordecai. Or if you like Star Trek, his name appears often. Marduk will meet Tiamat. Tiamat is in the form of a serpent, and she's a goddess, which is to say men wrote this story. Her name means chaos. All the male ambivalence about female in one word. She's a goddess and she's chaos, and we blame you. And you, because we would never take responsibility. So Marduk meets Tiamat in single combat, and he slays her. And in his victorious frenzy, he cuts up her body. And from her various body parts, by accident, the world comes to be. That's the critical thing. It's not a purposeful, intentional thing. It is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying absolutely 100% nothing, because it wasn't meant. It wasn't intended. It has no design or purpose in it. And guess what part gives rise to you and me? You know the answer, right? I mean, if I asked you to be myth makers, some of you would say the heart, because we're in Kansas City, Hallmark cards. The heart, or the brain, because thinking, or the tongue for speech, or the stomach, because we're never satisfied. We always want more and more. But they said human beings are the stuff inside the intestines, which is to say, human beings are not fully formed poo-poo potty. Not exactly a dignified posture, fair? And in that world comes this absolutely incredible, it's almost enough to make you believe in divine revelation, notion that human beings aren't poo-poo potty. They are created image of God. By the way, the word tselem is the only time it's ever used positively is about you and me. Otherwise, it means an idol. And if you know anything about the Hebrew Bible, it's more against idolatry than it's for God. The only appropriate symbol for God in the world is you and me. And how we treat each other brings God into the world or drives God out. What it also means is every human being is of infinite value, because you have Tselem Elohim in you, a piece, a part of God. Now, you're not God, but you are a symbol that points to the ultimate, the sacred. That's the bottom line of the creation story. Now, the second story with the apple and all that sort of stuff, that's dealing with mortality and sexuality as the response to death. But I'm happy to have us have a different point of view, because
We did, I'm asking.
no. My only point being that it's never occurred to me that there was just Adam, and then they got Adam and Eve, and from them all human. What it means is all humanity is connected. Because is this story. He murders his brother. What it really says is all murder is fratricide or soricide. It's not homicide. It's fratricide. It's killing the other who is your relative. But it gets more intriguing. Let's try to. Yeah, go ahead. I got to finish at 8, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if the claim then would be that the divine is inherent only in this species, or because this is a human story, it's unique to the human species.
But if you come next week, let's try with that one, okay? Because that's a challenge. But so I'll finesse it with the following: God created dogs so that we were the image of God. God created cats so that we know we're not God. So I want to get to what's really even more remarkable. Should anyone kill Cain, he would be avenged. And the Eternal gave Cain a sign that none who came upon him would kill him. Belly button, remember? Cain then went from before the Lord and settled in the land of nomads east of Eden. Now, in verse 12, he's going to be a ceaseless wanderer. 4 verses later, he settles down and he gets married, and he has a kid. And he builds a city, and he names the city after this kid, Enochville. Now, I said I have something like a good memory, used to. 4 verses later is not an accident. It's a dead giveaway. How can you be a ceaseless wanderer and settle down? And we all know that experience, because all of us, in some fashion, are in an alienated position from ourselves, are we not? I am much more than I ever thought I would be, much less than I should be. It's always the case for all of us, unless we become saintly and achieve some balance that is very rare indeed. Introspection is the great curse of leaving the Garden of Eden, and we can't get back. So, he marries. By the way, the translation misses he settles in the land of Nod. Now, those of you who know nursery rhymes, Lincoln, Blinken, but the Hebrew word means he settles in the land of restlessness. It's a little like, I wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member, Groucho Marx, That's the human dilemma. That's the curious circumstance of what it means to be you and me. So, what among the things that we could take from this story? 1, civilization begins with violence. Cain, the text says, is the first city dweller. Cities have always been and always will be places of danger. By the way, the Hebrew Bible has a prejudice against cities. I wish it didn't, but it does. And it comes about naturally. The word civilization comes from the Latin word for city. Not an accident. Cain, as a farmer, makes it possible for you to be a policeman, and you to be a poet, and you to be a soldier, and you to be a doctor. And specialization can occur. And not only can specialization occur, we need to protect ourselves, because these guys are going to want to take what we have. So we got to put walls. We need engineers. We need to protect our war, etc. Civilization begins in precisely this fashion, even though this is just a story that tries to portray the notion of civilization. You had a question or a comment?
This may be a little bit of comic relief, irrelevance, I don't know, but the seminar I attended this afternoon, the topic thereof was a serious investigation of whether Vladimir Putin would launch World War III.
Mm-hmm.
This is a group of people who do this stuff for a living, by the way.
Did they give a conclusion?
Well, no. But that intersects in an odd way with your observation that murder is all fratricide.
Mm-hmm. He doesn't believe it. And by the way, generally, mass murderers never believe it, because in order to do mass murder, I have to decide that you're not image of God. You are less than human, and therefore I can do... I'm going to give you an easy example, because some of you probably saw the Ken Burns.
You're not a member of the club.
All right, well, that's nicer, but I'm going to give you a specific. In Nazi Germany, it was still against the law to commit murder. It was just not defined as murder to kill certain classes of non-humans who looked like humans.
Well, that was my point. You're not a member of the club.
Well, I would put it slightly differently, because it's not just that you're not a member of my club, it's that you don't belong to the human community.
That's why,
No, but I'm looking at it from the German point of view.
Well, I think that's exactly what the German point of view was. You're not human.
That's what I wanted to say about the Irish immigrants, as far as they were depicted as non-humans, as apes.
We do that to every stranger. In fact, so here's a... Before I became a rabbi, I had a very brief career teaching English and writing. And one of the things we used to talk about in literature was there are 7 basic plots. Some argue there's 6. Tolstoy had a great line. He said there are really only 2 basic plots. The first story begins, a stranger came to town. The second story begins, I went on a long journey. Now, the whole Hebrew Bible can be unpacked in the following fashion. We are the strangers who come to town, and we are on a long journey. Now, folks, how do we treat strangers?
Horribly for the most part.
In general, we're frightened by strangers. We're put off by strangers. We're minimally suspicious of strangers. So I'm going to give you a low culture image. Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns? The man with no name rides into town, right? The good folk of the town are highly worried about what does this mean? Will there be trouble? The co-star is going to fall in love with him because he's the exotic, different, that breaks the monotony of my life, as opposed to the frightening different which is how most people will view him. Now, of course, we know she's wasting her time because at the end of the movie, he's going to ride off to the next adventure because he loves his horse. But I honestly believe that is a way of understanding the entire human enterprise and the biblical story for sure. We are the strangers who come to town. Which is, by the way, why among the things we're not going to talk about is Jewish tradition says the variation of the phrase, you know the heart of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, occurs 36 times. It actually is about 40-something, but the reason they say 36 is because it's a very significant Hebrew number. It's 2 times chai, 18, which is a symbol for high life. 2 times life, double life. So, let's take a look. If you know the heart of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. If you know the heart of someone, they're not a stranger. You may not know their name, but they're not a stranger. But why does the text have to say it over and over again? If it were normative, there would be no reason to need to say it, right? But it's not natural. And that's why we're over and over again told, darn it, do it right finally. But we tend not to, which is why we keep reading it and studying it and messing up on it, right? We have 4 minutes. I want to do one other thing real quickly, unless there's some other questions. Okay. One of the things that I've talked about is the economy of language in the Hebrew Bible. So, for instance, Moses is told, go up to the top of the mountain and be there. Now, why would you have to tell him to go up to the top of the mountain and be there? Be there is not necessary, right? But as soon as I say that, of course it is. There's endless number of times we're someplace we're not there. We're worried about the appointment tomorrow or what happened yesterday. I regularly think about it in terms of a life cycle celebration where one of the parents is videographing it. I know they'll be there when they finally see it, but they're not. They're trying to line up the right shot. There'll be more than enough time to be there. True story. We're old enough. Some of us remember Leo Buscaglia, the professor of love. Used to be a fixture of PBS fundraisers. He tells a story of himself. He's in Japan, being escorted by one of the great masters of the Zen tradition through one of the most important Zen gardens. And Buscaglia, if you remember, his skin couldn't contain himself. He was always filled with such enthusiasm. Right word, enthusiasm, comes from enthusiasmos, Greek for to be full of God. So, look at that. Oh, that's so magnificent. God, I've never seen anything like this. So finally, the Zen master, who has said nothing up to this point, turns around, slaps him across the face, and says, will you stop walking with your dirty feet through my mind? There'll be more than enough time to reflect on the experience. For God's sake, have the experience before you decide to be the great critic of it. I grew up in New York. We always thought being a critic was a substitute for being wise. It's not. There's time for it, but too often that we put it before we put the experience itself. Go up to the top of the mountain and be there. So what we're going to do next week is we're going to start with Jacob's dream, and then we're going to see, then we'll probably go to Jacob and Esau and their battle royal, and then, God willing, we're going to take a look at the single most remarkable detective story in the entire first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. I think you'll find it very interesting, which is Moses at the end of his life, we're told, saw God face to face, right? but we're also told that no one can see God's face and survive, right? We got to figure that one out. And we're going to try, at least I will try, to share that with you. So it's 8 o'clock.
Describe that by quantum entanglement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.